Should Christians be communists? That is, do the New Testament authors expect followers of Jesus to live in communities in which most property is shared? Not to spoil the surprise, but I do think the answer to this question is yes. My sermon today comes in 3 parts. The first is on poverty in America. The second is on the way of Jesus concerning wealth. And the third section is what we might practically do ourselves. Harry Edwards was the professor of the first class I attended in college. A famous sociologist who specializes in sports, he had been the architect for the Olympic Project for Human Rights. This led to the Black Power salute protest by Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. He knew personally almost all of the famous black activists that you would read about in the newspapers, and he taught about them with wisdom and with passion. Professor Edwards was probably the best-looking professor I had ever had. He dressed stylishly. He was 6'8" tall, weighed 240 pounds, and there wasn't an ounce of fat on his frame. They say that education is wasted on the youth. And I had no idea at that time how fortunate I was to study with him. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't think about where it was that he came from. This fall, I found out. I read his autobiography, The Struggle That Must Be. In it, he describes a night in December of 1953 to give the readers an impression of what it was like for people who were growing up in poverty in East St. Louis. In those days, 8 children lived in his household. At the time, his parents were constantly away working, and the children were pretty much left to raise themselves, with the oldest, Lois, at the age of 12, frequently missing school so that she could care for her younger siblings. There wasn't enough food. For a whole week, they might subsist just on cans of corn and beans. The house smelled rancid, with pigeons and rats infesting the attic, so that bird droppings would wash down through the ceiling boards during heavy rains. The basement was filled with coal ash and roaches. Dogs came in through broken windows and would come and die there. Inside the house, it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there were icicles on the walls. Only one burner on the stovetop worked. They had to go outside to the hydrant to get water. The outhouse overflowed and had become unusable, so they had to relieve themselves in the basement or in the yard. And yet, because television had not arrived, in those days, Edward could not see what the rest of the world was like. For him, those times before the family disintegrated were the good days. Edwards writes, quote, "During that time that seemed so distant and so comparatively happy, I saw my family as existing above the turmoil, the criminality, the filth, and the strange deadness, hopelessness that was pervasive in our neighborhood. I can still remember thinking, we're different, that we somehow were better than all of that." What came next in his life was in many ways worse, as Edwards became increasingly exposed to the racism of American society. After attending segregated elementary school, a segregated middle school, he went into an integrated high school, and after 4 brief incidents in his first semester there, he came to the conclusion that white people had engineered and were maintaining a system that constantly humiliated and demeaned black people. This made it nearly impossible to experience anything like real human dignity. The first white person he felt at all close to was a basketball coach in college at San Jose. When that man simply couldn't hear Edwards' concern about teammates who were joining fraternities with racist membership bylaws, he realized that he could never really be himself with that man. In today's gospel, Jesus is on the way. The way. That's how early Christians described themselves before the word Christian came into common use. So Jesus isn't just on the way to Jerusalem. He's not just on the way to his death on the cross. He's showing us a way of living. A rich man runs up to him. Imagine that. If someone were to run up to me right now and to kneel before me, that's what the rich man did with Jesus, and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus tells him to keep the commandments and lists off some of the commandments that have to do with how we treat one another, not the commandments that have to do with how we honor God. And the man says that he had kept them all. And Jesus, looking at him, loves him and says, "You lack one thing. Sell what you own, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Now, in that time, and as frequently is the case in our own, wealth was regarded as a sign of God's blessing. So the people listening to this feel astonished. If someone is blessed with wealth as this man cannot be saved, then who can be saved? And Jesus answers, "For God, all things are possible." So you may be saying to yourself, what does this mean? Some interpret this story as the justification for monastic poverty. Others see this as only the instructions for a particular person, that man in the Bible. Preachers have rationalized it, saying giving up possessions is only for those who have a problem with being too attached to possessions, too preoccupied with wealth, insinuating that all of us, that's not our problem, that's somebody else's problem. We're not the ones who are overly attached to wealth, are we? I can see that you're not. And then, of course, there is the natural conclusion that Jesus might really mean this and mean it for everyone. I believe that this challenging teaching just cannot be ignored. But also, I don't think there is some simple, individual, correct interpretation. Instead, it gives us the context to understand a continually recurring conflict that arises all through our lives. Perhaps the easiest part of this is that Jesus simply rejects the premise of the man's question. There is nothing that we can do to inherit, earn, or deserve eternal life. It is a gift that God gives freely to us, whether we are good or whether we're not, whether we've done the right things or whether we have avoided them. But at the same time, this does not let us off easy. Jesus may be saying the same thing to you this morning as he said to the wealthy man. You lack only one thing. Perhaps this could be the lack of trust in God that makes us feel desperately unsafe without our possessions. It could also be that failure of generosity, that hazard of wealth, which cuts genuinely good-hearted people from really being in community with others, and therefore from living a full human life. So to return to my opening assertion, the early Christians' churches were deeply suspicious of individual wealth. And I draw this conclusion on the basis of readings like today's and readings from the book of Acts, when, quote, no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything was held in common. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew warns against storing up treasures on earth. Luke says, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. And by the next time you're with somebody who says that they read and interpret the Bible literally, ask them why they, in good conscience, should feel like they should own anything. I believe the early churches were more like what we today would call communes, living out a radical, different vision of caring for each other in the midst of a violent Roman world surrounding them. You can see it in second century writers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian, in the writings of Didache. These ideas were still present even in the 4th and 5th centuries. In Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Cyril of Alexandria. We have a huge stained glass window dedicated to John Chrysostom notice it on the way out. John Chrysostom was the Archbishop of the See of Constantinople. He was at the very heart of the establishment of Christianity. And yet, he too preached frequently about this. He said, there's a great human estate that belongs to all of us. That idea makes me feel so ashamed that Harry Edwards and millions of others like him grew up with so little in the midst of such a wealthy society. Now, my point is that through the centuries, this idea keeps recurring in Christian life. The idea that every person has a claim on the collective resources of all humanity. The church today just tries to support the way things are, these property arrangements that we seem to have inherited. But the New Testament is not just a history book for us. It is not just about another generation's dreams of living in a world without deprivation or want. Jesus challenges us to not simply capitulate. Jesus teaches us that generosity lies at the heart of spiritual health. My last chapter is on what we can practically do right now. And let me tell you, I completely understand that giving away all of your property, I understand that's hard. And I even understand that it's hard to give away 10% of your income every year. That's a tithe. To give 10% of your income every year to charity, that's hard too. But it would be even easier for you to join with this cathedral in helping to correct an obvious and inexcusable injustice in our society. We all know that property and race are deeply connected in our society. In our society where human beings owned other human beings for a period of hundreds of years. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolishes slavery. However, it left open a dangerous loophole that has caused terrible suffering for generations, especially for people of color. Now, just to remind you of the 13th Amendment, it's very simple. It goes like this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. We want to change that amendment because forcing prisoners to work as slaves corrupts our justice and prison system. But most of all, these same practices of cruelty, intimidation, and humiliation can be even more destructive of human dignity than poverty. Now, over the coming months, you will learn more about what you can do to help Grace Cathedral in the important work of ending slavery for prisoners in the United States. What must we do to inherit eternal life? What is the one thing that we lack? This week I saw my strong, confident, and wise college professor as his 11-year-old self, barely surviving the poverty and racism in our country. And believe me, there's so much more I could tell, so many more stories of desperation. And yet, by the grace of God, he survived. And he has helped many, many people for decades. There are no easy answers when it comes to property, and yet Jesus' teaching about generosity cannot be ignored. We've come up short, and no amount of time, no amount of moral striving will be enough. But we do know that Jesus looks at us and loves us. We take comfort that for God, all things are possible. So let's see what we can do together.